Hello friends and gamers, and welcome to Fortress. My name is Jinx, and today I want to talk about an article I wrote many years ago called the Sea-Centric Season Proposal. It's a long article, and I don't know if I should go into depth with it, so what I'll probably do is put it up in the description. Maybe I might put it in a Dropbox for you guys to read, and I'll give a brief summary of everything that is said before I get to the interesting parts. So what is a Sea-Centric Season Proposal? It is a proposal to redesign the map's sea zones, and to make it, instead of being centered around land and islands and have the islands within the sea zone, it's instead to make the islands kind of the borders of the sea zone, something along those lines. You'll see it as I explain a little bit further. It has great benefits in it, and I think it's worthwhile doing. So with good ideas tend to rise to the top, and I've lost count of the number of times where I've shared an idea with another creative person who's working on this board game for fun, and they say, hey, I thought about the exact same thing. So you'll see a lot of tendency towards this thing. I believe this is a good idea, and I think in future games, maybe in Global War 4 or maybe Global War version 5, we might see this incorporated into the map. And I wouldn't be too surprised. It would make all kinds of sense to me. But without further ado, let's dive into it and show you what the article says. Sea-Centric Season Proposal, written by myself. Objectives. Well, my objectives is to make the game better, essentially, to make the game a little bit better. And in this objectives, I outline how oftentimes people are coming to this better game from Axis and Allies because they enjoy the depth and the complexity that Global War 36 has to offer. And Global War 36 has a fantastic map, so everybody that plays this game just loves the map. I think the map is artistically so much nicer than Axis and Allies has to offer. Next up, we have a picture here of Axis and Allies Classic and the artwork behind it. I actually don't mind this artwork for its time. You know, it was okay. It was okay for sure. But it's to keep this in memory too as we talk about future things. Introduction. So it's introducing that there was Axis and Allies Classic that came out in 1984. It was a board game Hall of Fame game, and as you see, it was quite a simple map. You know, you didn't have too many territories in Europe. Let's see, 1, 2, 3. Let's count. This is 4. Maybe this is 5. You see we have a lot of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Let's say 6 territories in Europe, not including Spain. If we count Spain, that's maybe 7. I don't think these ones were accessible. Switzerland and this. Neither was this place probably. So anyways, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 territories one could go into in Europe. So we've expanded quite a bit from that in Global War. You know, Global War has now a whole host of territories. I think when I counted it, it was close to 52 territories in Europe, including islands. So it's hugely changed the map. But I make a case in here saying that at least a lot of the conceptual design of Global War 36, of HBG's first design, was built upon the genre, upon Axis and Allies. You know, a few certain things stayed the same, and we'll get into what specifically stayed the same as we proceed through all this. But one could point out, at the very least, some of the sea zones stayed the same, which is a major topic of this video. Sea zones. That's what that introduction is about, and the precedent. Here we talk about Axis and Allies Classic. You know, in Axis and Allies Classic, it was a smaller map. You know, the physical dimensions of the board were smaller. There were less units. There were no destroyers or cruisers, escort carriers, torpedo boats, coastal subs. You know, they had none of that. Basically, it was a pretty simplistic map. You could launch D-Day from eastern United States. You have your ships in the water here. As far as I know, you know, I've never played this game, but I'm assuming transport still move 2. You could go 1, 2, and drop off in Normandy. So yeah, things are quite a bit different back in the day. And rightly so, the map design reflected that. It was primarily a land-oriented game, and so ships were basically there to protect, clear, hinder, and transport troops. You know, and sure, yeah, in the process of doing that, you'd wipe out the enemy fleet, but basically that's all that there was behind it. There was not too much behind it. It was a fairly fast-paced game, and so you had some necessity to keep the game moving quickly by having less territory and less sea zones. So as you see here, there's only a couple moves from USA to get to Europe, and likewise, there's only a couple territories in Europe. You know, from Germany, Eastern Europe, you're already pushing on into Russian territory, like within a matter of minutes, essentially. And likewise across the Pacific here too. 1, 2 to Midway Island here, or Hawaii. 1, 2, and you're into Japanese waters. So fairly quick-paced game. And just count too how many sea zones there were around here too. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 7, 8 maybe if you count that one in the Atlantic. So it's not that many. I also want you guys to take a special note here what I mean by land-centric sea zones. So that means the land is within the center of the sea zone. So you have land-centric. Borneo and Celebes are centric of the sea zone. Same with New Guinea, and in some extent, Philippines, Carolina Islands, Japan is, of course, and then Burma in some senses as well. You have the sea zone kind of adjacent to Burma, as well as India. Basically, the highlight of any sea zone is the actual land that it encompasses. That's the idea behind that. So sea-centric sea zones would be something else, which we'll get into momentarily. I mean, a good example of a sea-centric sea zone would be something like this in the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean in most games is usually quite good. So yeah, you see here it's more sea-centric in that sense. Moving on. So we've talked about the precedent. This is the precedent that I make the case that Axis and Allies is the precedent for global war. Historical board gaming, global war. A lot of the ideas are copied. And like I said, good ideas rise to the top. So what tends to happen is if Axis and Allies has some good ideas in a genre of game that's interesting and people want to develop it on it, yeah, then it stands to reason that HBG is going to copy those good ideas and make it work. I make the case that it copied a little bit too much and leaves that vestigial limb is now quite useless and kind of impeding the growth of HBG. Land-centric sea zones. So this is where I describe what land-centric sea zones are. Is the idea that the map design is primarily built around the army. Navies are an extension of the army. To illustrate my statement, take a look at Burma and East Indies and their respective sea zones. So here we have all these sea zones, right? So the idea here is, when I'm making a case here about Burma and East Indies, is this distance between Burma and the East Indies is quite minor. It's 40 kilometers away. Yet, theoretically, you could have an enemy fleet here in the East Indies and a friendly fleet in Burma, and they could essentially coexist, in theory, in the Straits of Malacca right here. So that's the case. It's like, it's not, we need to redesign sea zones so that they're not land-centric, but sea zone-centric, encompassing certain seas. So Singapore, for instance, was called the Gibraltar of the East. Is basically any ships passing through this area would be faced by the guns. Well, maybe not the fortress guns because they couldn't fire across that distance, but at the very least you could cut off any supply links between the fleets that passed through here. So it was almost essential to take out Singapore before you can move on past to India. So that's the idea there. And I also say that in the idea of Axis and Allies Classic, it made sense to design the map this way. It made absolute sense because, yeah, for this game at this scope, it needed to be done thusly. All right. So, and I take a quick peek here at Madagascar where you see, hey, look, this is not quite sea-centric. This is one island that's not land-centric, and these are sea-centric. This is the Straits of Madagascar, our Mozambique Channel, I believe it's called. So yeah, this is a sea-centric sea zone right here, Mozambique Channel. Yeah. Ultimately, in Axis and Allies Classic, the map design worked, and I make the case to say that later on it quit working as well. The map evolved to Global War 1940. So here we see 40 over here, and you can't quite see it in this breadth of the map, but when you zoom into it, you see that a lot of the stuff just stayed the same. So more units were introduced, and all this other stuff occurred. Europe grew from 8 territories to 23, Africa doubled in size, Asia tripled in size, sea zones grew exponentially as well too. Before we used to have maybe 6, and now we have, I would guess that's almost 30 right here. I would say something like that, right? So it grew dynamically, an explosive growth, and so did the board game keep up with that? The map grew exponentially, and new units are introduced, new mechanics, not lend leasing, but convoy rating and all this other stuff as well. So land-centric Navy was still the order of the day, but the stretch marks are beginning to show, meaning that the Navy was essentially just, an asset of the land forces, really, to really push people's armies across the water, American armies across into European theater and also into the Japanese domain, let's say. So it carried a working system from Classic into a bigger map. And so some of those flaws just started to grow and grow and grow. For instance, here we see one territory, Southern Europe. Now in Global War, it encompasses many more. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 territories, now from one territory. I also make the case saying that what used to be one jointed territory could move troops from, troops in Southern Europe also included Sicily. Now you need ocean-going transport flotillas to drop your troops off in Sardinia and Sicily. And I also say that this is only 3 kilometers wide, this distance here. There should be some means of getting a ship, some means of getting units here, and not just a trickle of units, but a decent amount of units to Sicily if one chooses to do so, because the distance is so narrow. All right, what else do I add? Especially in a 6-month time span, or whatever this would be. A 6 month time span, you should be able to get a lot of troops to Sicily if you so choose to do so. All right, what else can I add about this? Yeah, the map essentially exploded. I make a quick case here about aircraft, saying before when a single aircraft in Southern Europe could cover all these territories, now it covers only 1 out of 8 territories. And so its aircraft have decreased in utility and gone from becoming a good defensive unit to almost a primarily offensive unit. I mean, yes, defensive would still be okay, but offensively they're much, much more valuable, and the price of it reflects on that, right? And so I'm making the small case here, saying that look for my solution, an article, Dynamic Air Warfare, in which I basically say something along the lines of, we should decrease the combat values of aircraft, specifically for fighters. They should have a different combat value against land units, a different combat value for against air units, and the land again would be a 2, and the air would be 6. And the price of the aircraft should decrease as well too, down to 6. And I cover a lot of this in my system of house rules called JX36 Overhaul, which you can find on YouTube as well. So that's the case I make there. Moving on. There are parts of the ANA G40 map that are essentially all that has happened is that the C zone was cut in half. Still maintain the same ideas and standards of the previous version. So the Burma Sea zone has been split in 2 and go on as such like that, right? So we see New Guinea here. Essentially, it went from being one jointed sea zone to being split almost in half. Likewise, this one and this one have been split in half. Java and Sumatra have been split in half. The Philippines stayed the same. Burma has been split into, what would it be, 3 now? But yeah, nothing too drastic has occurred. Borneo and Celebes has split into 2 territories, and that's it. Nothing too much else has occurred. It's all roughly the same thing. They just split certain territories because for them it made sense, but I make the case saying that, well, you're outgrowing it, the stretch marks are showing, things are starting to crack, and it's not working as well as it could be. It still works, but not as well as it could be. And that's the case I make there. Yeah, moving on to other things. Stretch marks are beginning to show. 40 kilometers wide, 20 kilometers wide. It's going to say, like, yes, in this case you have Borneo and Sumatra. So here's Borneo and Sumatra. Hold on. Oh yeah, between Borneo and Sumatra, the distance there is 20 kilometers at its minimum from Borneo to Sumatra. It's a narrow little channel, and it's not reflective in this map as well. Likewise, these two, it's not reflective that the distance there is, what is it? Borneo, Sumatra, yeah. Well, I know this one is quite minimal as well too, right? So the distance between these two is minimal. The distance between these two is, let's say, under 50 kilometers, and the distance between Sumatra and Java is under 50 kilometers as well. The distance between Borneo and Celebes is another, underneath 50 kilometers as well. So you see my point is we see that all these should be a little bit closer together and in a sense form around the sea, form the borders around the sea zone. Moving on. I briefly touch on 1939 map. And I don't knock it too bad. I say it's a garish looking map. It is really garish. It really pops at you and really tells you where it's at, right? But a lot of the stuff, they do something different with this stuff as well. Like you see the amount of sea zones in the Mediterranean. It's a lot of sea zones in the Mediterranean. We see over here, these things are designed a little bit differently. They're not as land-centric as they could be, especially here with Sumatra. Borneo as well. Down here, Java still is, and these ones still are. But you see, like Philippines has been broken up and is now adjacent to many different sea zones. So altogether, this one was a little bit of a departure from the previous version, but nonetheless, it still is. This was a step in the right direction, I think, in some sense. But of course, it had many, many flaws. But yeah, it failed in concept and design with far too many sea zones in certain areas and much needed work in others. It was a first one, granted, absolutely. It needed a lot of work, but it was still not that bad. Moving on, the map of today. So I find Axis and Allies Global 40 quite ugly, to be honest. I'm very critical about things, and I think it pays to be critical. I like the fact that I could play on it, and it's something I cut my teeth on it, and I really enjoyed myself when I played it. But I find the map to be quite ugly. I still would like to play it. In fact, I think I'm going to be playing it next week, but I find it pretty ugly. Compare that to Global War 36. Look at that. That is just gorgeous. You have the lovely mountains here. You have everything just done up beautifully. Railways, you have all different gauges on here. It just looks gorgeous. It looks absolutely gorgeous. This is kind of obtrusively awkward, mossy green in color. The kind of texture behind is not the nicest, and you have, this tinge of national color behind things, that kind of obtrusive kind of 3IPP or IPC over here, right? Whereas this is just much more gorgeous. You have the kind of less obtrusive one on here. You have the nice roundels, you have the beautiful mountains, the railways. It's a little bit more proportionate than this is, right? Well, if you ignore Africa, but I'm not bothered by that, to be honest. And I think this is just absolutely gorgeous map. And it is, well, a hallmark. It's going to be something that will survive many other games. It's just the beauty of this map, especially the coastline here with the waves lapping along the shore. Just absolutely gorgeous, right? Fantastically designed game. Design map. Compared to Axis and Allies Classic, Global War 1936 is huge. Where once there were 8 territories in Europe, now there are 44 territories. And that's before the version 3 came out. With version 3, I think it's up to 52. So yeah, there's a lot of territories. And so certain things become a little bit more out of style or out of fashion, let's say. You have stuff like aircraft, where one aircraft in Southern Europe could cover everything at the same cost, cost 10 and attacked at equivalent of the same numbers it has now. Now it has to cover all the extra territories. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 11 territories where it once covered 1. So aircraft have somewhat lost their power to some degree, and I think that's why I've always encouraged people to play with that. Aircraft scramble from airfields rule, because then at least that aircraft comes back to a little bit covering a little bit more territories like it did in Southern Europe. It makes all kinds of sense to me. So where once ships could travel Atlantic in one swoop, now navies must plan jump-off points to launch and a route. To launch a D-Day attack in France or Denmark from New York now needs several moves and securing positions from possible counterattacks. So navies have grown in size. Things are huge now, right? Battle groups are no longer a thing from Axis and Allies Classic, and now each ship represents a certain amount of units. And I think this is maybe not the best idea, but regardless, that works, right? The second you slap a label on things, a number on things, then people will be like, well, that's inaccurate, that doesn't make sense, that they'd have this many ships and this and that. Well, we have to kind of ignore that because, let's say, for instance, infantry represent 50,000 men. I would say infantry represent 50,000 men in certain theaters, but in other theaters it represents less. In, say, Western Ukraine, it might represent 50,000, but in Africa it might represent only 10,000 because you're dealing with like larger supply situations. So yeah, numbers are difficult to play with, and perhaps they shouldn't have done that, but nonetheless, sure. Moving on. Global War does follow the precedent of Axis and Allies. There's no denying it, both in the combat rules, 12-side die instead of a 6-side die, but otherwise combat values remain largely the same, as well as in a few carryovers in map design, specifically in land-centric sea zones. So I'm going to go a little bit more in-depth now. Global War carries on the legacy and with it the precedent of the genre that has gone before. So I'm going to go into a bit more reading depth now. It just makes more sense at this point. Again, there are only so many ways to slice a pizza, but the HB C-Zone pizza was sliced using land-centric sea zone standards. We can see it most evidently in the sea zones around Southeast Asia. We see that the pizza has changed a little bit. In the case of Malaya and Sumatra, it's changed and flipped in some sense, but you see this sea zone around Java has essentially just split. These guys remain primarily the same. These remain the same. This has been joined together because this split, and so now it makes sense from movement values to get to Australia. You see everything more or less has stayed the same. Philippines is still encompassed by one sea zone, and up here, South China Sea has basically stayed with one sea zone with minor adjustments because of the flip between Malaya and Sumatra. But basically, it's roughly the same. Nothing too much has changed. It's still land-centric sea zones. Now, of course, you can't have 2 fleets occupying the Straits of Malacca right here. Now you only have one, essentially, that can be in that area. But nonetheless, you still have this sea zone at least. That is now split between 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sea zones. One sea is split into 5 sea zones. And so we have some difficulty there. These areas have changed. The Java sea zone was split into 2 land-centric sea zones. There are changes. The Java sea zone was split into 2 land-centric sea zones. The 2 sea zones in northern Australia merged into one, but ultimately little has changed beyond subdividing zones and compensating the distance for subdividing by merging other zones. Even the little border zip south of New Guinea has been copied from G40, but loses its purpose in Global War 36. And you see by that I mean in Axis and Allies Global War 40, we had this little zip to the south here, and that was to join this sea zone with this sea zone. But now we see in Global War 36 version 3, or what are we at? Version 2. So we see that this zip goes down south here for no purpose whatsoever. There's no reason for this zip to go there. And so I think this is proof positive. This is like a smoking gun to say that they copied a lot of the sea zones from previous versions from Axis and Allies. That is my smoking gun in this case. it makes sense because look, there's no reason for it to zip south. They could have easily just made it go straight down south. And you see in version 3 that they've gotten rid of this vestigial limb. They made it straight down south, but the fact that it goes here tells me that they were quite closely copying the sea zones from Axis and Allies. It's almost proof positive because there's no reason this should go south itself. There's no iteration on previous maps that had that. You know, if we look at the previous version, I actually don't have version 1 unless they count this as version 1. But you see here, in 1939, it went straight down. There was no reason for them to change that up. So we'll move on past that point, though. I think I've hammered that one too closely. HBG chose to have land-centric sea zones encompassing large islands, sea zones splitting sea zones, channels, and ignoring straits. Very little change in the sea zone design standards of HBG. The system worked excellent in Axis and Allies Classic. It functioned in Axis and Allies Go G40, and it does the job in Global War 36. But something is lost in the making of land-centric sea zones, and there may be a better way of doing it. A better system of design, a system that makes sea movement more interesting and dynamic and interactive, that promotes geographically and historically important key zones, places like straits and channels and sea zones, and allows the naval war to become a dynamic battle of zones of control. Sea-centric sea zones. The sea-centric sea zone map style would redraw sea zones and shape them by geographical features existing in the world. A sea zone's border would be shaped by large islands, the coastline, natural narrow points, as well as sea zone size and the historical importance, while at the same time keeping in mind the distances involved from a gameplay aspect and also capable of breaking from geography to enlarge a channel on the map to permit space for a fleet. To illustrate the concept, let us look at Southeast Asia. So you see here kind of a before picture, right? You see that what we're quite familiar with, all these little different trains and such. Land-centric sea zones. So land is in the middle of a sea zone, land in the middle of a sea zone, etc., etc. There are a little bit of exceptions here and there, but for the most part, you see it's land-centric sea zones. And this is my redesign of what it would look like. You have, you know, the Java Sea here. You know, the Java Sea is adjacent to all these sea zones, and that's the historical way it was. The Andaman Sea is right here. The Bay of Bengal, the Banda Sea right here, the Arafura Sea. You know, the distance between New Guinea and Northern Australia is not much. I believe it's only 50 kilometers between this point and here. I always use that 50-kilometer point, but 100 kilometers, right? In the idea of sea, 100 kilometers is almost nothing. For you other people who don't use kilometers, that'd be what, 50? No, 60. I believe it would be 60 miles between here and here. I think it's not that much. So yeah, you see this is all designed around sea zones, the Solomon Sea. Historically, the Solomon Sea was encircled essentially by the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, New Britain, or Rabaul over here, right? Same thing with Bismarck. Of course, Bismarck Sea I've stretched out because Bismarck Sea should actually only be up here, but I've extended a little bit to carry on that same name. Same thing with Laccadive Sea. It was just a little bit right here, but I extended it to be the whole thing. But everything else, the names are there. Let's use the names. And it makes the islands much more important as well. This is using Google Maps as a helping tool, as opposed to just making up our own thing. If we see here, we see the Java Sea is encircled by these islands. The distance, like I said, between Australia and New Guinea, you know, that distance is not huge over there. You have the Java Sea here. You have the Celebes Sea, the Banda Sea, the Timor Sea, the Arafura Sea. You have all these seas, you know, the Sulu Sea, South China Sea. You see everything here that I see. You know, it makes sense that it would be sea-centric sea zones. The way that HBG does it, they just draw a square around Borneo and say that's a sea zone. Well, it makes much more sense that you have the Java Sea as an individual thing and the Celebes Sea over here as its own. The Philippine Sea, of course, is one big sea, and so you'd have to split it in two. But looking at the map, looking at our article over here, we draw that out. We say, you know, here's the West Philippine, the East Philippine. I even draw the North Philippine Sea, bordered by Palau, Guam, and Okinawa up there. So here we have Palau, Guam is over here, and Okinawa is somewhere up in this chain of islands. And so we're bordered by that, plus the Philippines. It just makes all kinds of sense that we are encircling our navies by the land around. It makes things much, much, much more interesting. So that's my case on there. Here's the Coral Sea, and the rest of the map could be done in the same way as well. And I've done a little bit more on this, but what's the point really, right? As you see, Borneo is no longer encompassed by a sea zone, nor is the Java Sea split into 3 sea zones, or the Malacca Straits unacknowledged. The sea zone transitioned from being shaped by the land to being shaped by the sea. You see over here, that is the Java Sea. if you compare it to this, the Java Sea is one body. Over here it's split into many. We have the Banda Sea, the Arafura Sea, the Timor Sea, and here they're split into parts, right? I mean, some people could say, well, this is the Banda Sea right here, and this is the Arafura Sea. But yeah, you know, I think this system looks much, much nicer. And you would still have to calculate. Like, this is not perfect by any means. A person would still have to calculate and say, it's the equivalent sea zones to get from India to Australia, so it doesn't change up the gameplay aspect of the map. But, you know, if you calculate it from this way, 1, 2, 3, going from Bay of Bengal, you could get to the western coast of Australia. It's off map over here, but you can get to the western coast of Australia, and the second one will get you to Sydney. And the same length of time that would go this way, 1, 2, 3. Well, you won't even get that far. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So yeah, you can go this way through the Malacca Straits and get to the western coast of Australia. So it's the same thing. 1, 2, 3, 4 will get you there to Arafura. 5 will get you there, and 6 will get you to Sydney. In this case, it'd be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, it's the same thing. So I designed it in this way. I did a decent job. I designed it so there's still 6 sea zones to get from India to over there, and that's the same thing that what we have over here from both directions, from Bay of Bengal southwards around the southern point of Australia or the northern point. It's the same design. So a person could tweak these as necessary, but I think future iterations of Global War 36, if they adopt this idea, you'll see something very resembling to what I have here. With names might be changed and they might stick to sea zones instead. My proposition is to have Bismarck Sea, West Philippine Sea, and for a lot of these smaller ones, just keep it as is. But when it comes to the bigger oceans, like the Atlantic Ocean, then you would do something like Atlantic AZ1, you know, Atlantic Ocean 1, or Atlantic Sea Zone ASZ1, ASZ2, and so with Indian Ocean it would be ISZ3, for this would be the Northeast Indian Ocean, right? It would make sense to do it something like that. This is what I think we'll see in the future iterations of the game. Version 4, version 5, we'll probably see something similar to this. But not as nice, of course, because I'm a fantastic artist. All joking aside, moving on. This changes the standards of the map, I admit it, but consider the redesign on its own merits rather than the fact that it changes things. Resisting change for change's own sake is not forward thinking. Instead of looking at the problems alone, consider the problems and the benefits gained. It breaks away from land-centric sea zones and shifts the center point to the seas, the Java Sea, the Timor Sea, the Andaman Sea, the Bay of Biscay, the Gulf of Finland, the Skagerrak, the Caribbean Sea, naturally shaped zones humanity has identified and named. It does not split seas and channels, just like Mozambique Channel between Madagascar and Africa is not split. So here we see in Global 40, it's not split, for the most part. Here we see Axis not as classic, and here we see here. So the Mozambique Channel is already an existing part of this mentality. The land shapes the seas, and not the seas by the land. Of course, design is needed to maintain the right amount of sea zones between land territories. India cannot be too far away from Africa or Australia, but I've worked through that, and the HBG designs for sea zones further away, from large islands or continents are still excellent. I've redrawn the map, and even in places where the most changes are made, from Sydney to India is still 3 moves away. Sydney to India, 3 turns away, or 2 turns, I guess, depending on what you're moving, is 3 moves away. Traveling historical routes from India to South Africa is still 3 moves away, so 3 turns away. In short, I slice the pizza a different way, and it still works excellent and feels much more natural and dynamic, and yet does not complicate the map or add additional sea zones. Here we have another illustration of what I've already shown you. This sea zone is split multiple times. Here is the Google Maps image of what it looks like. We have the Java Sea, the Celebes Sea over here. And yeah, here you have the same thing. The Natuna Sea is a relatively new name for this area here, this shallow area here. So if that carries on to the next thing, who knows? But this is also part of the South China Sea. It's only locally it's named the Natuna Sea for this shallower part. Yeah, that's the idea there. And you could also make it that these are choke points too, right? Where you have narrow crossings from here. And if you build the coastal artillery here, you could fire on passing ships through these narrow areas. And you could say anything underneath the range of, say, well, I don't know, 15 kilometers. If you put a gun right here, then if it's under range of 15 kilometers, you can fire at anything that passes through. You could also mark these narrow crossings in red, right? Put the narrow crossing right here in red and say, well, if it's a narrow crossing in red, you could non-combat move, whatever you like. I think there shouldn't be a limit, because this is, if the second you start putting dates on stuff and say it's 6 months, well, in 6 months, if there's no enemy surface ships adjacent here, in 6 months you can move ships across, right? Or as many years as you like across to these ones. That would be my proposition. I don't think there should be a limitation on what you move between these ones. It wouldn't make sense. There's ferries, there's boats, there's canoes, there's rafts. You can raft across a lot of this stuff. Moving on. Large islands. This I'm going to briefly touch on. Well, maybe I'll read it. With sea-centric sea zones, large islands can be attacked from multiple sides. If you consider this a problem and dig your heels in, remember in World War II in New Guinea, when the Japanese controlled the Solomon Sea area on the north side of the island and the Allies controlled the Coral Sea in the south. So here's Solomon Sea and the Coral Sea in the south. They fought back and forth across this little narrow bit. The Anzac fought this brutal campaign across this over here. And the respective fleets reinforced both sides, supplied both sides. And that's impossible to do in this map, in this Sea Zone 126. It's all one area. The Kokoda Trail campaign, where the Anzac and the Japanese fought across the steep inclines in brutal and bloody series of battles. The Tokyo Express, where the Japanese reinforced islands from one side and the Allies attacked it from the other. There are other cases where an island was invaded from different sides at different times, but regardless, the operational scope of Global War 36 and even Global War 14, as well as the map's physical dimensions, can easily allow large islands to form the borders of a sea zone in exchange of the island being adjacent to 2 or 3 sea zones. So we see here in the Solomon Islands, the Japanese can reinforce the Solomon Islands and the Americans push through on the other side, right? It would work to do it this way. Everywhere, basically. I think it would do a fantastic job everywhere. Surprisingly, transitioning sea zones into sea-centric sea zones reduced the amount of sea zones on the map and actually, on average, increased the volume of space for fleets within a sea zone. At the same time, controlling a sea zone became more meaningful since there were fewer sea zones and bypassing an enemy fleet became less of an option. So, by that being said, if the Japanese fleet held Natuna Sea over here, the British or Anzac could not bypass it as easily, would have to go around this way to get north if they wanted to, right? So in this case, it's the same as if you'd have it on this one, but you get the idea. All these narrow crossings can form a border for other players coming up north this way. All right, there's also more volume of space. So around Borneo, if you have a land force in Borneo and a naval force adjacent to it here, well, you have a pretty crowded sea zone, and it's all squished in there. You need a task force marker. Whereas if you do it this way, you have all this space over here in the Java Sea. It's clearly defined as the Java Sea, and you have your other units sitting here in the middle of it. It makes all kinds of sense, and other games are already doing things like this. Any host of other games are already doing it this way. I'm not sure why HBG insists on staying with their original system here. Now, this is not casting shade on HBG. They're evolving and discovering and becoming a better and better and better game. Absolutely. But still, this is a proposition to make things even better. All right. Conclusion. HBG Global War 1936 and 1914 should, at its very foundation, break away from the design of Axis and Allies and judge everything on its own merits rather than the merits of what they've done before. The physical dimensions of HBG global maps are huge. This allows a great number of territories and sea zones and allows the operational scope to be narrowed. The Axis and Allies' classic idea of battleship battle groups roaming the entirety of the Southeast Asia in one sea zone has long been left behind. The introduction of destroyers and cruiser groups in G40 and the increase of territories narrow the scope further and begin to crack the design concept. HBG's narrowed operational scope breaks the design concept still further and leaves only a mediocre design, and a design which other games have surpassed by basing their designs on sea-centric sea zones. Here we have, I can't remember what this game is called, but you see it's exactly what I've been describing before. The Arafura Sea, this one's not named, but the Timor Sea, the South China Sea, the Philippine Sea, it's all over here as well. Now, of course, they aren't doing it exactly because the Marianas are within the sea zone, it looks like, right? But in other aspects, around the Dutch East Indies, it makes all kinds of sense. Here we have another game called, what's this one? War in Europe and Asia, I believe it's called, and it looks pretty neat. I'd like to try this someday. But yeah, you have the same kind of idea here where the islands are not the center of the sea zone, but rather they're adjacent and forming the borders around it. And here we have a video game which some of you guys might be familiar with, which is Hearts of Iron 4, which, yeah, you see the same story here executed. The island is not in the middle of a sea zone, and the sea is center. The sea is a sea-centric sea zone rather than a land-centric sea zone. This concludes the Sea-Centric Sea Zone proposal. See the articles on Dynamic Seas package for additional articles on straits, crossings, naval movement, and much more. So here I have a little image of some of the other stuff on here. I don't have it all, of course, but here's some of it. A lot of it I don't have named because I was still debating on the idea of ISZ1, for Indian Sea Zone 1, Indian Ocean Sea Zone 1. But yeah, I think it's all measured out here quite nicely, and you still have the same range as you have in the previous map. So just to illustrate here one last time, here we have the existing map design. Here we have Google Earth, how it looks, and here we have what it actually exists like. Let's zoom out on this one so you can kind of see it a little bit. The difference, I think, speaks for itself. It's much more interesting to have a map like this. That's it, everyone. So thank you all for watching. I know it's been a little bit of a long video, but this is something I wanted to show you guys and release it to you guys. Thanks all. Cheers.